Over the last few months, memory and specifically RAM prices have been increasing significantly, and a few people have asked about the consequences for Nintendo. While I do often cover economic issues, I'm generally a bit more cautious about technological ones, which isn't really my area, and generally I would prefer to defer to people like Digital Foundry. I've taken a bit of time to look into this, and I'll give my perspective more from an economic than a technological standpoint, but I'll pin any comment that addresses misconceptions and make adjustments as necessary. With all that said, let's dive in. Firstly, the cause of RAM prices being high is that rapid expansion of artificial intelligent data centers is creating a hunger for memory. Indeed, all types of memory seem to be under some cost pressure. Micron, a computer hardware company, recently ended a line of consumer solid-state drives in favor of strategic customers, specifically AI companies. Now, this wouldn't affect memory on Nintendo peripherals like the microSD card, which is long-term storage rather than random access memory that allows processors to handle tasks quickly, and indeed, it doesn't affect RAM at all. Therefore, while this problem is multifaceted, the issue here is really for the Switch 2 motherboards. In hard numbers, the suggestion from Tech PowerUp is that the memory Switch 2 uses the 12GB low power double data rate 5X LPDDR5X from here, raised in price from $33 in January to $70 per module in November. Note these aren't going to be the prices Nintendo pay with their corporate negotiating team and fixed-term contracts, but it may be indicative of the general trend and the underlying proportions that we might see in terms of cost increases. I've also seen speculation that costs could double again next year, which on these prices would mean a $100 difference in the cost of the machine from those manufactured prior to launch in 2025 and those manufactured in the 2026 holiday season. It's unlikely that if Nintendo were to be affected in this time period, it would be to this degree for the aforementioned reasons, but of course it's very hard to predict with any specificity when there are so many moving parts. After all, this doesn't just affect Nintendo. The chips for the Switch 2 motherboard appear, per a report from Bloomberg and relayed by Nintendo Life, to be provided by Samsung. However, they're designed by Nvidia originally, though Nvidia itself doesn't make the chips. Furthermore, they appear to be assembled at Foxconn, and the memory itself, despite being on a Samsung motherboard, has reported to be coming from South Korean firm SK Hynix, although this may not be Nintendo's only source of these memory chips. All of these companies will be affected either directly or indirectly by this, with pressure to cut costs or increase efficiency, and with ever more pressure put on them by corporate customers, such as Nintendo, creating a very complex scenario. Now, Nintendo will likely have negotiated its own arrangements with all four of these companies, and this creates quite a number of moving parts which we need to take into account when considering the impact of RAM prices on the Nintendo Switch 2. From the outset, we can assume that the design of the chip has been sweated over by Nintendo and Nvidia so that as far as possible with technology of this kind, it is resistant to most immediately foreseeable price shocks, at least at the time of its development. That's important at the design stage because video game consoles are not like phones or laptops where redesigns happen fairly frequently. The intention will be that they have years on the market with this thing, and that requires stability of supply. Now, I'm not an expert on the designs of these chips by any means, but it seems to me that having SK Hynix provide the specific memory offers Nintendo a degree of flexibility because the other major manufacturer would be Samsung. Samsung already provides the chips themselves, and so it's very much in their interest to keep a good long-term relationship with Nintendo, who, while by no means the biggest kid on the block, is still a fairly significant name. And so Nintendo potentially has two companies incentivized to make the situation work for them, though, of course, ultimately, Nintendo's place in the pecking order will still be below many other purchasers of chips, consoles, phones, servers, and increasingly automobiles. It may be that there are other technological workarounds conceived of in the design stage that would permit Nintendo maximum flexibility mid-generation. Of course, one adaptation would be simply to use less RAM in the first place. Currently, the Switch 2 relies on that 12GB of the new LPDDR5X memory, but according to Digital Foundry breakdown near launch, around 3GB of this is reserved for the system. Now, we don't know exactly what that's being used for, but obviously a significant feature here is still game chat. Zoom recommends 4 gigabytes being available to run it, but it's not like Zoom is built into the hardware in the way that Game Chat is, and obviously Game Chat is rendering poorer image quality and with more limited numbers of people, and let's face it, it's probably highly optimized because Nintendo has spent a lot of time making it work on Switch too. But all the same, it clearly has the potential to tax the hardware more, even if, as standard, it wouldn't reach that kind of memory hunger. I also assume that Nintendo would aspire to contract the memory requirements of the system over time with progressive upgrades, permitting internal studios and third parties to become ever more ambitious across the generation, though that's a pure guess, and others might have a better insight here about what is and is not possible. Even if Nintendo could detach Game Chat, would they? Nintendo does have form with ditching core system features on their budget models. The 3DS ditched 3D, the Switch Lite ditched switching, so it would kind of make sense for a low-end Switch 2 not to have Game Chat. However, redesigning their operating system feels more complex in some respects than just chopping up a physical part, as they did with previous console iterations. A more reasonable accommodation might be to permit only sound when using Game Chat, or to allow Game Chat to connect via some kind of external app. The Hori Piranha Plant camera already uses a lower resolution at the cost to some Game Chat functionality, showing that there are possibilities for other applications of the way Game Chat works, which might save some kind of memory usage. As I was finishing up this video, there was a suggestion from regular commenter Politiclank that they might even be able to repurpose Switch 1 chips for the Game Chat feature on a light mode. Even if this were technologically feasible, and it's the kind of out-of-the-box thinking Nintendo like, even if it does feel very out of the box, my guess is that they will have quite precisely ordered the Switch chips they need for the rest of the generation, and one of the reasons for the hard pivot to Switch 2 may well be that they ran the Switch stock as low as they could during 2024, and now they want to hard pivot rather than trying to negotiate for further chips, probably at increased prices. All the same, while historically Nintendo revisions have tended to keep the same memory, or, as with the new 3DS, increase it, if they could find a way to get by with 10 gigabytes, not 12 gigabytes, without materially affecting the performance of the system, I guess that would have some advantages. However, as far as I can tell, LDPPR memory comes in fixed iterations, and redesigning a motherboard layout mid-generation and hoping it will work feels like it has a huge risk to fragment the audience and cause chaos for Nintendo that would itself incur costs. Remember the effort they put into ensuring Switch worked on Switch 2? Well, now imagine that compatibility problem all over again. Having said all that, there's obviously an upper limit to the kind of adaptations Nintendo can make without driving up costs for themselves. Another way they could mitigate this is by binding long-term contracts with their suppliers. The risks of these contracts is higher initial prices, but the benefit of these contracts will be far greater supply resilience. Given the relatively high cost of Switch 2 in real terms compared to prior consoles at launch, and given how absolutely vital establishing a quick and broad install base is for the company, I think it's highly likely that they would have made contracts with the long term in mind, and this might make it harder for other companies to renegotiate with Nintendo in the medium term and charge higher prices. Indeed, one of the reasons that RAM prices are escalating isn't just the relatively fixed supply and the new sources of demand, but the strong existing centers of demand, and obviously major companies like Apple are motivated to have long-term supply of chips and are also likely to have rigid contractual arrangements of their own. Given Nintendo's baseline caution with these kinds of things, and they've had the experience of the pandemic to show them that things can go badly wrong if they don't have some kind of contingency planning, I think there's a strong case that they would have opted for a contract that in the short term might have been less favourable, banking on a longer term payoff. After all, during the pandemic, they found that constricting supply couldn't match rocketing demand, but it didn't really matter so much in the middle of the Switch's lifespan. It would matter hugely at the launch of a new system. Another strategy that they could have employed already is stockpiling, and we know that to some degree they did this with Switch 2 already. Particularly with the uncertainty over global trade terms, it's clear that, for example, a large number of units were shipped to the US quickly and early, allowing them some flexibility with regard to tariff concerns. However, there is a limit to just how much they can plausibly stockpile, and huge risks occur with having masses of inventory just sitting there, from physical risks such as fire, flood, and break-ins. Insurance would pay the upfront costs, but the momentum lost would be devastating in its own right, to economic risks, such as that the demand might not have been as strong as they initially hoped. Imagine sitting on 20 million Wii U's. Unlikely for Switch 2, but stockpiling only gets you so far, and the fact is that while they have broadly managed to keep up with demand, there have been frictions in Japan especially, and we probably have to face the fact that with strong demand in the summer and another strong burst of demand this Christmas, plus a further surge likely around the launch of the Super Mario Galaxy movie next year, it's hard to identify a point where Nintendo could plausibly have piled on lots of extra units to secure supply for a rainy day. However, high fixed supply does have some benefits, including economies of scale, i.e. the savings from producing in bulk. It seems likely that they would have negotiated differential prices based on the amounts they needed to order, and so by massively bumping up demand, they would have benefited from some large discounts anyway. Even if these discounts evaporate against rising RAM prices, it may only have a limited impact if the quantities being put out are sufficiently large. That said, even if they sell a squillion Switch 2s, it's still a drop in the ocean next to mobile and other customers. Still, other architectural costs, including all the other aspects like display panels, backlights, the plastic, shipping rates, and so on, are compressed by large sales numbers due to the same economies of scale acting on them as well. This makes it even more important that Nintendo keep driving sales in the medium term, despite the apparent shortages. This is certainly the strategy that Furukawa was hoping to utilize when quizzed by investors on this back in November. At that point, he said, "We believe that we'll be able to maintain the current level of profitability for hardware for the time being, unless there are significant changes in external factors, such as a shift in tariff assumptions or other unexpected events. While we are aware that the costs of various materials are rising, we also anticipate some areas where cost reduction may be achieved for Nintendo Switch 2 through ongoing mass production efforts. Therefore, currently, we do not expect the recent rise in material cost to greatly impact profitability. We will continue our efforts to maintain the same level of profitability as we currently have." End quote. Note that this talked about profitability, which is a little different from the perspective of a consumer focused on price. One would expect profitability for a new system to increase over time. Indeed, the original Switch and Switch Lite have been said to be far more profitable per unit sold than the Switch 2. Therefore, a stable profit arrangement is less than ideal for the company in many respects, because currently one would assume they are being quite a bit less profitable than usual with the system. But evidently they set against this their overall expansion goals, which should bring in more money, their recent relatively profitable period in the 2020s with older hardware continuing to be sold, and the likelihood of several major projects coming to fruition in the coming years, including a new film project and games in their biggest selling series. In other words, if they make a little less on their mid-gen consoles than is traditional, well, they may have lots of other ways to make this back up. It depends, of course, on scale, and this is something that's hard to fully anticipate. If RAM prices go supersonic through 2026, then it's very difficult to imagine Nintendo holding their current prices, because it would cut too drastically into their profitability. Furukawa was talking about the current foreseeable situation, not about a hard and fast rule for all time, and he was very clear that he was talking about keeping a consistent level of profitability, and if he's not going to risk this system becoming unprofitable, then the only place to get that profit back might be by raising the price to the consumer. Of course, some people speculate that AI currently has the features of a bubble, and this might actually lead to RAM prices dipping for a period of time in the years ahead. Now, even if that's the case, the long-term trend is probably locked in. The dot-com bubble might have temporarily set back the development of the internet economy, but seen from the perspective of 2020, internet businesses are doing just fine. The bubbles are more a result of speculation of value rather than anything else, and fundamentally AI is memory hungry, and this is something Nintendo will need to adapt to over the long term, although, to be fair, so as well will their competitors. So, what are the likely consequences for Nintendo? One significant casualty may in fact be the original Switch line. While the first two models have always had a high profit margin, and the OLED probably has an okay margin, despite never being quite as high margin as the original two, if the costs of memory for these systems skyrockets, producing them not only becomes less attractive, but could actually hurt their case to accelerate Switch 2 production. We already saw evidence of this thinking in the slightly surprising announcement in November that they were already discontinuing efforts for the original Switch, despite its vast install base, and while it may still be a long time before currently planned games work their way through the system and are released, so we won't see immediate changes, I think this situation will only expedite their plan to cut their losses with the original Switch. It also creates a tricky problem with variants. Generally speaking, using the precedent of Switch, we might expect a light model in 2027 or 2028 and a refresh of some kind in 2029 to 2030. The mid-gen system we can stick a pin in for now, as that's a very long way off, and there are many things that they could do there, but a light version of the system would normally be intended to offer the console at a lower price. That's tricky if their profit margin isn't that large to start with. Switch Lite was two-thirds of the cost of Switch, but it feels unlikely to me that they'll manage a $300 Switch 2 Lite using broadly similar form factors to the original Switch Lite if it turns out that these kinds of memory costs are locked in. There are also timing issues. If they're relying on economies of scale to get them through the next year or two, splitting their focus is going to have short-term costs, and there's even a risk that people who might have opted for the full-fledged Switch 2 might instead buy the cheaper option. Switch Lite was never the most successful of the three Switch form factors, accounting, as of the end of the last financial year, for maybe 15% of total Switch sales. Now, those sales were weighted towards being relatively early on during 2019 and 2020, when getting the console into more hands was a greater priority. But if Nintendo can successfully shift a massive amount of Switch 2s in 2026 alongside the next generation of Pokemon, it will have broken with the tacit assumption that seems to have underpinned the 2019 Switch Lite launch timing, that they're reliant on the existence of a handheld system to reach specific kinds of customers. Clearly, even in Japan, where people are much more committed to handheld gaming, there is a broad acceptance that the Switch and Switch 2 form factors are perfectly fine handheld experiences which have extra utility, and so there may be less pressure immediately to go for a lighter model. Now, that's not to say that Nintendo will skip a light variant entirely. From the Game Boy Pocket to the DS Lite to the 2DS to the Switch Lite, this has been Nintendo's go-to move for a long time after a system launches, and the utility to them is to sell multiple versions of a console so that, potentially, everybody in the home can have one. But since they're currently utilizing Switch for this, through Game Share, and there are so many Switches in the wild, they probably don't urgently need a light console in 2027 if they can't find a form factor that provides enough cost savings that they can offer a compelling enough price drop. As for near-term price increases, well, Furukawa says no at the moment, but things are changing quickly, and while he can't lie to his investors, he doesn't have to lay out the company's market-sensitive contingency planning, where he can just say, not at present, and have it be both true and reasonable. I would guess that they will have a threshold in mind, after which they will bump the price. Otherwise, I guess they will try to lean on high-price peripherals and aggressive expansion of services such as Nintendo Switch Online, which I think certainly will have a price increase before too long. Ultimately, there are so many moving parts and so many uncertainties between the state of the market, the various companies involved, and Nintendo's own plans. I'm sure it's something that Nintendo will continue to assess, and I think it has the potential to be a big issue for all of gaming in the medium to long term, even though for now the mood music for Nintendo remains broadly positive. I try to put my feelings into percentage terms for posterity, but this one, more than usually, feels a little murky. For now, though, let's say this. I'm going to say I think there's a 50% chance that there is an increase in Switch 2's price in the US territory by the end of 2026. I'll use the US territory because it's the largest and most eye-catching. Of course, RAM costs might not be the only reason here. The fact is, Nintendo generally absorbs costs under most circumstances mid-generation, but we live in interesting times. I also think there's a 30% chance that a future Switch 2 variant restricts game chat somehow, maybe not deletes it, but at least constrains its functionality, perhaps dipping the resolution, for example. It feels an unlikely step, but we've seen unlikely steps before in mid-generation refreshes. That's all for now, but do check out these videos on screen. Many thanks to the channel's Patreon supporters, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.